And first off, I'm Jared Heiner. I am the Director of Education for Aspire Technology Partners. I had a background in education where I worked at a number of different school districts and trying to advance slides. Of course, I'm the one that didn't practice. There we go. Look at that. So long story short, having worked in school systems before, E-rate is one of those things that's wildly important, but often underutilized. So we decided to put together an outstanding panel for you, kind of the content experts, if you will, for all things E-rate. And E-rate, it's complicated in the sense that when we start looking at what our objectives are in schools, we really want to start looking at funding, especially with technologies. Within the last 8-9 months, our technology budgets have transitioned wildly. And so I'm excited to have Vince LaForgia on, who is the founder and CEO of E-rate Consulting. We also have Vince Saragusa on, who works with Cisco. He's part of the sales development and grant strategy team, as well as Sandeep Krishnan, who is the president and CEO of MedTech Interlinks. And so what we're going to do is go through, each of them is going to be presenting on some content, and at the end, we're going to save some time for Q&A, but feel free to utilize that chat feature that you'll notice on the bottom. If you take your mouse, go to the screen, tap on it, it'll give you an option to go to chat or Q&A. Feel free to go and put questions, comments, thoughts in there, because this is going to be so much more valuable if it's interactive. And I'll just say this, in my experience, there's 3 different types of schools. You have schools that are looking at their projects, looking at their funding and making 5, 7, 10-year plans. You have schools that utilize E-rate as part of that, but then you have schools that are saying, well, we've got E-rate, so we'll spend some of that money. Then you have schools that aren't utilizing it all. Everything's been thrown into a blender. It's a matter now of being very strategic and tactical, which is why we brought these 3 presenters on. So I'm excited to have them here. I'm excited to be able to kick this off. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Vince LaForgia. Vince, welcome, and let's get into it.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks. Great. So, take control. Hi, everyone. I'm Vince LaForgia. So we just want to, talk really briefly kind of what is E-rate, right? So E-rate is a program that is created by the FCC through the telecommunication, created by Congress through the Telecommunication Act of '96. It is run by the FCC, administered by USAC, and it provides discount funding for 2 categories of services. Category 1 is your basic internet access and your inter-district WAN connections. And then category 2 is some of the equipment we're going to discuss today. Okay, great. So category 2 equipment, right? And services. That's the equipment necessary to transport the internet across your district, right? In your buildings, across your WAN. How do you do it? You're using switches and some of these other equipment we're going to get into, right? It also allows you to manage your network and have some time and material work to make sure that your network is basically, modernized every couple of years. So for example, right, this is the basic crux of what's eligible for E-rate right now. You have the access points and the controllers. Now, there could be physical controllers or there could be cloud-based controlling systems. You have network switches, right? Core or edge switches. Firewalls. Firewalls are a little tricky. They are eligible, but a lot of the security software that's attached to those firewalls are not eligible. And those are things that we're looking to change with the FCC. Routers. Racks are eligible as long as they're housing eligible equipment like switches. Caching equipment, if you're a large district and you need to cache, you're able to do that. Licenses for almost anything that is an eligible equipment is also eligible. So if a Meraki shop and you need a 3, 4, or 5 year license to make sure that you have a right to use that equipment, those are eligible licenses. Installation for eligible equipment plus the configuration of it, that's another, those services can be E-rate discounts. You can obtain E-rate discounts for them. Basic maintenance is a little bit of a trickier category. So that could be something like Cisco SmartNet, but it could also be an hourly break fix contract with a provider that allows them to come in and do eligible work on eligible equipment, right? So maybe updating the operating system on your switches or kind of reconfiguring your access points so that they work better in your environment. Okay. So to receive category 2 funding, you do have to apply mostly on a yearly basis, right? So you have to post what's called a Form 470 that starts the E-rate bidding process. It's always important to remember that you have to follow E-rate regulation, but one of the E-rate regulations is to follow local and state procurement rules too. So the trick is to kind of marry all 3. You can't just say, hey, I followed E-rate, but you did not listen to state law, right? So you have to do both. So, but from an E-rate perspective, you must have a 470 posted for 28 days. That's their competitive bidding window, right? Any contract signed before the 28 days expires is going to be ineligible for service. So you have to wait the 28 days. And that's actually 28 days after any kind of Q&A takes place. So if you do have a QA period, the clock starts again. The 471 is the actual application saying, hi, USAC, we've actually awarded 50 Meraki access points to this vendor, and we want to put it into our high school, and it's at this cost, and we want an 80% discount. So you put that on the form 471, and that will get reviewed by USAC, and they'll come back with funding commitments. A form 486 is kind of just red tape. Hey, I was funded. The service is going to start. We're going to ask for money. And then there's really two ways to get reimbursement. There's the bear form or the SPY method. The bear is when the applicant pays in full and receives a discount. And then the SPY is when the provider gives you a discounted invoice. So you do have the opportunity to say, well, I have a $100,000 project, but I'm an 80% district. You may only have to outlay $20,000 and the provider can go to USAC for the other 80. Okay, so C2 budgets are important because the FCC gives every applicant a budget, a fixed budget, right? So they've started using 5-year cycles. So we're actually going into the first 5-year cycle, which will be 21 to 22, right? Fiscal year 21, 22, and I'll end with the 25, 26 fiscal year. For this cycle, every district is going to get $167 per pupil, okay? So basically, if you have 1,000 students in your district, you have $167,000 budget. That's the most E-rate eligible work you can do, and you will receive a discount off that budget. They've actually changed budgets so that they're district-wide now. So they're no longer site-specific. It was, you had a budget per eligible school within your district. Now you can spread that budget across all sites. If you have a project at the high school that requires more of your budget, that's great. If you have an elementary school that's coming online that might require more of your budget, that's okay too. They've increased the budget floor to $25,000. It was $6,700, which wasn't really enough to get work done in the building. And one of the great things is they're actually getting rid of the equipment transfer rules starting July of 2021. So you can move equipment between buildings, which you hadn't been able to do in the past without notifying USAC. So you can actually enter your enrollment for the first year you want to use your C2 budget, and you don't have to change it for the 5-year budget. So for whatever reason, if your enrollment goes down, you can keep the higher budget, and that's perfectly permissible under the rules, okay? If for some reason your enrollment goes up, you're able to go change that and ask for more money. You only have to validate the enrollment in the first year. And you're still gonna have to give either your free reduced lunch or you're gonna have to prove your poverty level through an accepted means to prove what kind of discount rate you actually have. Okay. There's 2 ways to calculate C2 budgets. If you're a district with 11 or more schools, you would basically have to calculate by the number of pupils times 167, right? Or the number of schools. So theoretically, and we use this as an example, if you had 80 schools in your district, but you only had 10,000 students, you would still get the 25,000 per school, right? Because the other method would give you a lesser budget. Most of the time, you're going to end up having a higher budget per pupil. So if you end up with like it says here, if that 10,000 students, you would have the 1.6 million. So we talked about the transfer rules going away, which is great because that allows you to use E-rate equipment at one school and say, oh, this equipment doesn't fit the needs there. We put it in the high school. Maybe these access points aren't the right access points for the high school. Let's transfer them to the elementary school. And we can go out to bid for high school access points the following year. There's no harm, no foul there now. So you can actually do that. You are required to keep track of the equipment and the serial numbers and to know where everything's housed, because if there is an audit, you are responsible for being able to bring them to that equipment. So, really, right, the key kind of with E-rate that we have here is it allows you to continually plan your life cycle refresh, right? So you can go and say, hey, these access points, these switches, they're probably going to give me 3 to 5 years of life. And instead of having to hold on for year 6, year 7, year 8, where your support costs continue to get higher, you can go and say, all right, well, I can go use the E-rate program to cut my, my outlay into this new environment, which would, help you drive down just the cost of managing an older infrastructure, right? So I think that's really has become important about E-rate, that if you take time to plan it out, it can really be an asset and a partner in kind of, building out your networks. And just some things, and not me specifically, but anybody to kind of talk to if you're using a consultant, right? The rules are a little tricky. There are some gotchas. There's rules upon rules, which happens with any government program after 20 years, right? So there's things to kind of keep an eye on. Things are changing. Things are changing with the FCC constantly. I mean, for instance, with COVID, they announced a new window when they had never done that before, and all districts were able to go get more funds for their E-rate for increasing bandwidth, which if you're not in tune with this, you're not going to see it come across your desk, right? So there's a number of things that anybody in my career can kind of like walk you through. And I think, there's probably good reason to reach out and ask them for some advice. And that's it. I'll be around for QA, and I'm going to kick this off to Vince Saragusa.
Terrific, Vince. Yeah, appreciate the introduction and transition. And, interesting on this end to kind of see the evolution of E-rate over the last few years. And you hit on some of the big changes this year. Fundamentally, again, the allocation moving from the building to the district, as well as the transfer rules, which are, significant changes. We hope at some point, become a bit more understanding around some of the network security needs, which Vince hit on as well. But I think it's interesting on this end. So as Jared mentioned earlier, a little bit ago, I'm a Cisco Public Funding Advisor and effectively monitoring the funding landscape. So be it federal grants, CARES Act, state funding, E-rate, bonds, whatever it might be. Interesting in that we can kind of take an E-rate program or the E-rate program, which is fairly complex at times, but very structured, very linear, very clear in its support. But I think it also becomes important to kind of understand, where to monitor, how to digest, and if possible, plan for other alternative funding sources, especially as budgets are in flux and state and local revenue, obviously in decline in some scenarios. So, what I want to do early on is really encourage everybody to kind of think of E-rate as the network foundation that drives all the applications and all the use cases in the real world and in the classroom, and to leverage, various other alternative funding sources as a way to help stakeholders engage and consume what's available. Along the ways, obviously, pandemic's top of mind for a lot of initiatives, a lot of programs, and that's built again on a lot of the network infrastructure pieces that Vince just hit on. So if we look at the next slide here with a quote I found interesting, and as I read it, I kind of get different interpretations each time, but came from Theodore Roosevelt about 100 years ago. I think it was 1912, 1913. And each time I read it, I kind of come away with a different perspective. But what it reminds me of, I was on a webinar not too long ago with an IT administrator out of Texas, and she was mentioning now, and we hear the mantra of do more with less, and she was reinforcing the point that we're really not in that do more with less scenario. It's become a do less with less in many cases. That also, just from perspective, I speak my wife, who's a high school English teacher in Western New York, and very plainly I said, what's the biggest challenge right now that you're seeing? And her answer was student engagement, motivation, and just getting students to intrinsically want to learn. And my follow-up question was, if we went back 15 years ago, how would that be different? Would it be easier or harder? And she quickly drew attention to just, again, mentioning the use cases, how video-enabled collaboration and chats and virtual office hours and the ability to connect with students one-on-one has been, something without that mechanism. And they are an E-rate district who's, tapped E-rate quite a bit. New York State, many of you will be familiar with the Smart School Bond, tapped into Smart School Bond for some of that collaboration. And, that's mirrored to a certain extent with CARES Act as well, given the holistic nature of what the program supports. So, this slide here actually predates COVID by quite a bit. A couple of years ago, we put it together, and I think it still does a fair job representing the massive shift in education and how students are learning and how educators are teaching, obviously necessarily a little bit different nowadays. None of us could have guessed, obviously, how quickly this transition would be in place. And how quickly the rapid adoption of this technology is really necessary for impacting the classroom and teachers, but reinforced in many cases with E-rate again as the foundation and other alternative funding sources, including the recent CARES Act program, as a way to basically reach and enable these stakeholders for a little bit better educational engagement. Again, I hope E-rate, as it evolves over the years, and again, they've done some really great things of really internalizing and adopting a lot of the suggestions from various stakeholders, be applicants, service providers, consultants, et cetera. With hope, we'll see more around network security and maybe some in-home connectivity, but that's to be determined, at least from the E-rate perspective. But it does pair well with CARES Act. So we're coming out actually more in the middle of the initial CARES Act allocations. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the process and what's going on. Effectively, different buckets of money for higher ed, K through 12, local government, police, depending on that vertical and what you're looking at. But principally with CARES Act that passed back in March, two principal buckets. One dedicated specifically to school districts via the ESSER program, and another kind of sister program that actually goes to the governor, and the governor has the discretion to steer it towards different categories and different end users, if you will. Some, like New York State, took the ESSER allocation and the GEAR allocation, combined them into one allocation and gave it all to districts. Others, like PA and New Jersey, took a portion for K through 12, a portion for community colleges. PA actually had a portion for local government as well. So interesting in that, that basically, depending on the purse string holder, if you will, different buckets impacting different initiatives. I bring this up now. So I think as we look forward, and I'll have a slide very quickly on, what we think CARES Act 2.0 will look like. But effectively, they're probably, they being that the federal government, going to mirror the existing formula, and rather than reinvent the wheel, basically take advantage of the mechanism that's already in place and just supplement that with additional money. So the first round back again in March, I think it was roughly $14 billion for K through 12. And if things hold true to what we think is going to happen, even as soon as this week, should be some additional money basically going behind that same mechanism. Looking at CARES Act as a whole, basically every investment out there, no matter the vertical you work in, is intended for direct response to the pandemic. So it's interesting in the interpretation of what the pain points folks are dealing with and how to address it. Educational technology, very much a priority at the federal and oftentimes at the local level. So you can see here from the couple arrows, purchasing education technology, very much eligible. And kind of the catch-all at the end here, other activities to maintain operations and continue services. So it's that continuity of engagement, of services, of professional development, of education that really is the principal focus of all this money. And interesting on this end, just understanding and reading and discussing many times with K through 12s around what those pain points look like and where that money is intended to be earmarked. I hear everything from network security to density monitoring, knowing who's in a room and how far apart they should be, down to end user equipment like Chromebooks and laptops and distance learning software and increasing broadband access and in-home connectivity and transportation logistics. So obviously there's a diverse number and opinions on, again, what local pain points look like and how to best address them. But I want to draw attention to the open-ended nature of many grant programs, and certainly a lot of the CARES Act money that basically kind of allows for local flexibility to steer towards again those pain points and what you need to see supported. So I want to encourage everybody, as you're planning around network upgrades or plugging the gap around network needs in general with E-rate, couple that with discussions around what the pain points and what the priorities are, both under CARES Act as it sits now, as well as future stimulus bills, which again, we might see some color as early as this week. I've included a couple links here, so if you're not familiar with what your state's doing or what your allocation is, or at least the high-level process, these links bring you right to the state education website that breaks down some of the logistics involved. And holding true with CARES Act, and I think whatever the follow-up stimulus bill looks like, generally speaking, it's Department of Ed money, U.S. Department of Ed going to states, then states going to local school districts. What's going to be interesting moving forward, I know there's been some ebb and flow with school districts, public school districts working with their private parochial counterpart. I believe the intent moving forward, and this is a bit of conjecture, but I believe the intent is for a dedicated allocation to those private institutions that doesn't necessarily require them to meet with their public counterpart, which I think certainly will help with efficiencies and helping pin down priorities. U.S. Department of Ed doing a pretty good job, and really across the board through all CARES Act. They're really trying to create some level of transparency. So here's a quick link here where you can click on your state, see some data on what's been spent, what's left, and kind of reinforce what either peers are doing or what's happening internally. And then again, moving forward, a bit of a guess of what's happening. This is happening in real time. The additional stimulus bill. As we sit today, I believe there's going to be a vote in Congress as early as this week. I'm reading it as around $82 billion for education, which dwarfs the initial CARES Act allocation. So very soon, I believe we will have some color around the mechanism, the timeline, the priorities, the allocations, et cetera, that really help schools know and plan for what they will have access to. So as that's fleshed out and as we have those details, consider everybody on the panel here eager resources to enlighten around what we're seeing and where we're getting the material. So, again, as those questions pop up, I think one, it becomes timely to plan for and kind of internally prioritize. Hopefully, technologies come into the forefront, but prioritize what and where that money is going to be steered. Obviously, a lot of competing needs, a lot of hands in the cookie jar, but all this is holistic enough to really cover. Again, that notion of continuity, and if we compare CARES Act and then, again, the additional stimulus bill with E-rate plans, then, I think we have a real good story to tell and multiple funding sources coming together for a holistic initiative. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Sandeep. He's actually a grant writer not too far up the road from me, just outside of Rochester, and he's got a ton of insight from the grant consulting end that I think is very valuable and applicable to what we're talking about today. So over to you, Sandeep.
Thank you, Vince, and good afternoon, everyone. So when we talk about building your K through 12 programs as a school district, if you look at it holistically, end to end, there are three building blocks. Like the two Vinces before me, they talked about the E-rate program, which pretty much gives you the funding to put your broadband infrastructure together. But then beyond the broadband, as you develop your technological ecosystem with the data networks and everything else that goes into the school district so that you can collaborate, educate, and interconnect, you need to have the equipment and systems. And then once you have the broadband and the systems in place, that is where the fun begins. That is where you really get to develop your programs that benefit the students, the staff, the teachers, and the administrators. So in terms of broadband, and now each of these building blocks come with unique funding streams. Again, just as I'm not going to belabor the broadband side, but as you know, with the E-rate program, you get subsidies and funding to explore and expand and upgrade on a continual basis. You can do that with your broadband infrastructure. But once you get beyond broadband, there are other grants, and I bring in particular, there's a USDA distance learning grant, which provides funding on the data networking side with switches, routers, and wireless access points. If you want to bring technology back into the school building and the classrooms, so you have conference rooms that can be equipped with all kinds of smart boards, video conferencing systems, so on and so forth. And then it can, as you go further into the classrooms, you have all the desktop units and WebEx licenses, so on and so forth. There is a funding stream for this. Again, it's interesting because on the E-rate side, you have USAC. On the USDA side also, USAC is very much involved. Some of the mechanisms are same, but there are other unique factors. But I think rurality is also a big part in this. And then if you're a school district and you are building multiple locations and you have collaborating within a school district or outside, there are mechanisms for funding through USDA for that as well. And then as Vince Sirgusa mentioned earlier, with the CARES Act, there'll be many other funding opportunities that come for expanding and upgrading your equipment and systems. And then last but not the least is once you have, like I said, once you have the broadband and the equipment set up, there, again, through the CARES Act, through federal and state and foundation grant funding opportunities, there'll be pockets of money available for developing these programs. When on the educational program development side, it's less, it's about 50-20% is allocated towards equipment, but the rest of that is for developing personnel, for staffing, for marketing, so on and so forth. So what we can do, typically what we advise from MedTech standpoint when we work with our clients is to look at a grant funding roadmap. So if you're looking at the 2021 calendar year, or academic year, I'm sorry, is to sit down with partners and figure out what do you want, where do you want to spend, what do you want to spend, and how do you want to spend, and where is the funding available. And that kind of assessment happens in two ways. One is to figure out, like Vince mentioned earlier, is to look at what kind of broadband needs you have, what is the technical gaps you have in your network, and then to say, you know what, I have a roadmap and what I want to build, now where can I get the funding from? And that is where we can come and help you. We can help you with a grant, developing a grant roadmap, and so that as and when these grants come, you're not running around trying to figure out who do I work with, what paperwork do I do, and there are some nuances. Like you said, like Vince said earlier, you really need to understand each of these grant fundings come with some unique requirements, and the earlier you plan, you're better off in terms of getting funded. And another unique part of this is once you do get funded, the chances of you getting funded in the following years tends to be much better in some of these grant options available. So in aggregate, the three building blocks, coming back to, you have a broadband, equipment and systems, and the educational program development. And in all of these within all of these building blocks, you have funding opportunities, but the real opportunity for you is to thread all these requirements together and come up with a grant funding roadmap. And then we are here to help. You just let us know. And now I'll hand it over to Jared, and we'll have some questions and answers. Thank you.
So thank you, Sandeep, Vince, and Vincent. A lot of great information, and I think part of the obstacle that we face is trying to sit down and figure out how do we really step forward into all of this. And now, certainly for those of you that are on, feel free to put some questions in. I do have some questions that have been generated, but I'd like to also hear from our attendees. So if there's something you're curious about, a specific technology, and one of those, and I'll put this out to the panel, there's a lot of conversation taking place about cloud. And I bring up cloud because so many of the technologies are essentially transitioned to the cloud. What does that look like for future planning purposes?
Jared, I'll jump in from the CARES Act perspective, as well as grants in general. When we look at grants and why they exist or why a program exists, I mean, generally speaking, as a grant maker, you're looking to invest in an outcome. How we get there, be it technology, professional development, or anything in between, is up to really the applicant to pin down, in terms of defining variables. CARES Act is unique in that, basically those allocations, intend to support ways to address the pandemic that otherwise, just wouldn't be in place. Not necessarily designed to go back and recover lost revenue or to recover, budget on previous expenditures. It's really designed moving forward how to address the pandemic. So, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud or, any other unique scenario around how the logistics are set up, it's the outcome where you want to be tomorrow that where you aren't today, that's really, designed under the program to be supported. So, Good in that it's open-ended, a little bit different with E-rate. I think, that there is structured eligible service lists, which, cloud services very much are eligible depending on what you're actually trying to do.
The transport now, right? Also, so we see a lot of districts increasing their bandwidth to have external data centers, right? So, I mean, as cloud services become more important, you don't want to ingest everything over your internet pipe necessarily. You may have a secondary connection from your core facility, your NOC, whatever, right, to a third-party data center where you're accessing, AWS or Azure directly. So there are things that I think, even from the E-rate world, that are becoming, you're seeing an increase in bandwidth everywhere, and the additional need to have more robust switching and more robust circuitry because of the cloud-based services, where stuff was initially residing at one facility or in a closet at that district. It's not anymore, and they need to have strong, reliable networks to be able to access that data offsite.
And so it sounds to me like really Vince, to Siragusa, to your point, looking at what your problem area is, and then coming up with a plan of attack for that problem area, and then breaking it down based on all the different available funding mechanisms. Because like I said in the very beginning of this, we see folks that have traditionally said, well, I'll use this money, for example, the E-rate money for telecom things. And that was all it ever was. It sounds to me, especially now with where we are in the last 9 months, we may have to do some sitting down and some planning first.
Absolutely. I think it's planning all the way, especially if you're looking for, with the pandemic, you have to start pivoting into new innovative ways of reaching your audience. And I think so to understand that, you have to understand technology. That's where you bring the partners. And then you really sit down and figure out where the funding, some of these funding mechanisms are periodic. So you can kind of forecast, and the other one, they just show out of the blue. So we have to really sit down and plan for that.
And so that's a great question, because if I'm a superintendent, Sandeep, I'm most likely looking at consistency. The last thing I want to do is roll into a program and go, uh-oh, what do I do now? And so from that perspective, from a grant perspective, how do I? Because one of the things I'm hearing is that needs to be part of your, essentially a part of your financial process is looking at grants, but that can be a very scary venture. How do I overcome that and feel comfortable in doing it?
Again, I think it's basically sitting down. I think, like I said, even between the E-rate and USDA, there are some unique differences between those grant funding, but they all from a school district standpoint, from the superintendent standpoint, they're all means to a goal, even though they are different funding streams. So we are here, each of us come with an understanding of those unique funding streams. So the key is to sit down. And just one more point I want to make is they all come with you have to have a match. Like with E-rate, I know there is a matching component. With a USDA distance learning grant, there is a matching component. So when you look at your finances, you can put a scope of work for all the equipment that you want, but you also have to make sure that you are good on that 15-20% that you have to sign up to. So again, the far ahead that you know about these things, you'll be better off. So that when the grant comes, you're not trying to figure out where do I come up with that 15%.
Yeah. So let's say that I'm a school district and I utilize a third party, and that can look in a number of different capacities, regardless of what state it is in, for things like connectivity, bandwidth. I'm sitting there saying I utilize either a private company or I utilize one of the state-sponsored. So up in New York, we've got the BOCES and the RICs. How does the grant funding, the E-rate, all play into having someone else? Can I use those funds? What are kind of the gray areas in there, or is it not possible? Let's say I'm using a regional information center or a BOCES. Can I use some of that money?
Well, from an E-rate perspective, if you're asking, right, they term what's the BEN, right, the build entity. So the build entity is expected to pay. So if you are partnering with a BOCES and they are actually paying for that service, they would be getting the E-rate reimbursement for that service, right? It's that simple. If the BOCES puts the application out as the BEN and you're a consortium member of that BOCES would end up basically obtaining the E-rate funds. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but you can also get services or help from a BOCES if they're considered a provider of services to you, and you can apply for E-rate funds. So it's somewhat nuanced. It's really going to depend on the relationship between the member district and the consortium.
Good. And that does answer the question to some degree with respect to E-rate, because a lot of schools will see that E-rate capability and go, well, I'm utilizing a third party. So it's coming from third party. It's not something that I can apply for on top of the discount that I get from the third party. Got it. Sandeep, it looked like you were going to say something.
And then with USD, it's a little different because it's the school district that is applying for the funding. So, but the school district would work with a vendor to identify the bill of material, the equipment list. But when the funding is awarded, it comes to the school district, and then the school district works with the vendor and then disseminates the funds to get the project taken care of.
Gotcha. Are there any other questions from our audience? Does anyone have anything pressing or questions that are pertinent to where they are right now? I know that a lot of folks are already taking a look at E-rate. My question for each of the panelists, while I keep an eye on that chat feature, how would I go about engaging with any one of you if I was so interested? Obviously, they can come through Aspire, but what if I'm sitting there saying I've got some questions? How do I get in touch with you?
Yeah, good question, Jared, on this end. So again, I'm public funding advisor at Cisco. I think the easiest way to get any sort of assistance from our end, whether it's research, consultation, pulling up historical awards, any sort of insight is right either directly to your Cisco rep or the Aspire team. Basically is indicate what we're looking for, kind of the high level details of what we're trying to dig up. And, I get a lot of engagements where folks are saying, hey, we actually more and more with E-rate where, last year we had our match secured with our E-rate application, but obviously 2020 hit and things have been cannibalized and budgets have disappeared, and we need to basically find new sources of investment to in this case to be met by E-rate money. So really through Aspire or directly with your Cisco rep, it's probably the easiest way on my end, as well as direct outreach. But any sort of color or again research that might help the effort is really what we're intending to support.
And if you're looking to develop a grant funding roadmap, like I said, for the academic year or for a 2-year plan, MedTech works very closely with Aspire, and basically Aspire can sit down and figure out all your needs in terms of the broadband equipment requirement, the data networking, the end user equipment, and then MedTech then says, here is how you can, based on what your needs are and what your matching requirements are and what your rurality is, here are the grant opportunities. You already know about E-rate, so that's something you're good at. But then if you want to explore beyond that into equipment and systems and into program development, that is where we can sit down with you and say, here are the pockets of funding available, and here is the timeline. And so we can pretty much put together a good roadmap, and then as and when these grants become available, we start executing. And then hopefully you get funded, and then we can start quickly working on the implementation as well. But the other thing also to keep in mind is this developing a grant roadmap is typically a 6 to 8 month process. So the sooner you start on that, the better off you are.
No, and that's good to know. Because again, I think the planning, from the sounds of it, the planning is ultimately the most crucial piece of all of this. And then Vince LaForgia, again, from my perspective, I'm sitting here saying, listen, yeah, it's a great thing to say. I want to connect. What do I need to do to get through to you? And also, what should I be bringing to you?
So, okay, well, easy. I'm Vince at erateconsulting.com. Send me an email, right? So it's all one word, erateconsulting.com. And really, the time now is to plan. We know we're going into holiday break. All the districts are, right? So that's a week away. It's pretty soon, right? You're going to take a couple of weeks off. You're going to come back in January. You're going to have an idea of what you want. A proposed bill of materials, potentially, right? Access point switches, what you're looking for. And that's going to have to go out to bid soon, because the 28 days, if you do that at the beginning of January, you wait 28 E-rate days. Now you're in the beginning of February. You're going to have maybe 4 weeks to make an evaluation, make an award, potentially get a Board of Education approval on that award, and then file your E-rate application by the March deadline. Now, the deadline's not set yet, but it's usually the third week in March historically. Again, with COVID, we'll see if changes are made. They did change it to April last year. But yeah, shoot me an email or reach out to the Aspire team, and they can get you my contact. And, at least if nothing else, I can help you out with the timeline to kind of what data you would need just to move forward with the E-rate process.
The quick question from my end, just from the consulting standpoint. Given obviously the current environment with the pandemic, what are you seeing with walkthroughs and how vendors are coming into a school or not coming into school to kind of know the lay of the land and what they want to propose? Are there new wrinkles this year?
We've been making a lot of the walkthroughs non-mandatory instead of mandatory, and then trying to post a QA from that. So that's kind of elongated the bidding process. With a mandatory walkthrough, as long as you say it's mandatory, if a bidder doesn't show up, they can't place a bid and kind of move on to the next one, right? But in this case, it's a little tougher. A lot of districts happen to either be virtual or partially virtual, so it hasn't been a terrible situation with the walkthrough, but it's a little touch and go. And frankly, I have some scheduled, and we don't know what's going to happen a month from now, right? I mean, it could be a totally different environment when the walkthrough is scheduled for January 15th, and we don't know where we're going to be on January 15th. But right now, we've just been doing non-mandatory walkthroughs. And again, that's a lot of times the walkthrough will be more specific to the service piece, or if there's a specific nuance thing in a closet or a core facility. A lot of times people know, they want an access point or they want X amount of switches. And really it's a straight procurement when maybe we give them a little information on how the configuration will work. We do some QA there, post that QA, and then go forward that way without a walkthrough.
And it's a great question. And Vince, I know that in my own experience, we've actually had a couple that were done off hours, again, just to make sure that the students weren't in. There's fewer staff, even some weekends. Again, I know schedules and it don't always work that well, but even with the upcoming breaks that are taking place, it's a good opportunity to get people into the school just because you don't have the volume of folks there. But again, there's some, it's tricky no matter where you're at. But long story short, gentlemen, I appreciate you coming in, sharing a little bit of your expertise. I think this is a wildly important conversation, considering that, again, everything has changed. We are seeing a greater reliance on the funding streams. We're seeing a greater reliance on outside experts being able to come and provide guidance, as well as the innovation on behalf of the schools and the support organizations to be able to say, hey, we've got some solutions in place. So happy to keep those conversations going. We will be taking this presentation and making it available. So anyone who's interested in sitting down and listening to this again and reaching out, the information will be there. So Sandeep, Vince LaForgia, and Vince Saragusa, I appreciate you folks coming on, and for our attendees, thank you for joining. Hopefully you were able to glean some information that's useful, and we look forward to helping you move forward with all things E-rate and grants related. So thank you.
Jared.
Take care.
For holidays.
Take care.